I know she's dead. I know she's dead. Those 5 words, repeated like a desperate prayer, would echo through the cold December air outside a modest home in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. A school principal stood trembling, having just witnessed something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Inside that house lay the body of a beloved 6th-grade teacher, her face so brutally beaten and covered in blood that she was barely recognizable. The entire residence had been torn apart, transformed from a warm home into a crime scene of unspeakable violence. And this horror occurred just 4 days before Christmas, when the world should have been filled with joy and celebration. Before we go any further into this disturbing case, I need you to do something crucial. Hit that subscribe button right now. Every single subscription to Cold Case Room helps us continue investigating these forgotten victims, these unsolved mysteries that deserve answers. Smash that like button and drop a comment telling us which cold case you want us to cover next. Your engagement literally keeps these stories alive and pushes the algorithm to show this content to more people who care about justice. Now, let's dive into one of the most frustrating cold cases in Pennsylvania history. Christy Mirack wasn't just another teacher. She was the kind of educator that children remembered for their entire lives. The kind who stayed late to help struggling students. The kind who brought warmth and encouragement into every classroom she entered. At 25 years old, she had her whole life ahead of her. A future filled with more students to inspire, more lives to touch, more Christmas mornings to celebrate with her family. But on December 19, 1992, all of that was stolen from her in the most violent way imaginable. When Christy failed to show up for class that morning, alarm bells immediately started ringing. This wasn't like her. Christy was reliable, dedicated, the type of professional who would call if she was even going to be 5 minutes late. Her principal, growing increasingly concerned as the morning progressed without any word from her, made the decision to drive to her home. He had no idea that he was about to walk into a nightmare that would define the rest of his life. The scene that greeted him was something out of a horror film. Christy's home, normally neat and welcoming, had been completely ransacked. Furniture overturned. Belongings scattered. And there, in the midst of this chaos, lay Christy herself. Her face was so severely beaten and bloodied that it took him a moment to even process what he was seeing. The brutality of the attack was overwhelming. This wasn't just a murder. This was rage. This was personal. This was someone who had unleashed absolute fury upon an innocent young woman. The principal's mind struggled to comprehend what his eyes were showing him. He stumbled outside, his body moving on autopilot while his brain tried to catch up with the horror. All he could say, over and over again, was that she was dead. He knew she was dead. There was no doubt. No hope. Just the terrible certainty that Christy Mirack would never teach another class, never inspire another child, never celebrate another Christmas. When the police arrived at the scene, they found themselves facing one of the most brutal murders Lancaster County had seen in years. The level of violence inflicted upon Christy suggested this was deeply personal. The killer had spent time with her body, beating her face repeatedly, ensuring that the beautiful young teacher would be unrecognizable. The savagery of the attack pointed to someone who knew her, someone who had strong feelings about her, someone who wanted to completely destroy her. The investigation began immediately, with the full force of local law enforcement thrown into finding Christy's killer. This was a small community where everyone knew everyone else. Surely, the investigators thought, this case would be solved quickly. Someone must have seen something. Someone must know something. In a town like Lancaster, secrets don't stay hidden for long. But as days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, the investigation began to stall. Despite the massive effort, despite the countless hours of police work, despite the community's desperate desire for answers, the killer remained elusive. It was as if whoever had committed this heinous crime had simply vanished into thin air, leaving behind only questions and grief. The timeline of that terrible December morning has been reconstructed through painstaking investigation. Christy had been alive and well the evening before. She had spoken to friends and family. She had prepared for the next day's classes. Everything had been normal. Then, sometime in the early morning hours of December 19th, someone had entered her home. Whether she knew this person, whether they had broken in, whether she had let them in willingly, these questions would haunt investigators for decades. What happened in those final moments of Christy's life? Did she fight back? Did she scream? Did she have any idea that her life was about to be taken from her in such a brutal fashion? The physical evidence suggested a struggle. The condition of her home indicated that she hadn't gone quietly. But ultimately, she had been overpowered by someone stronger, someone more violent, someone willing to beat a young teacher to death just days before Christmas. The autopsy revealed the full extent of the horror Christy had endured. She had been sexually assaulted. She had been beaten repeatedly in the face with such force that her features were nearly obliterated. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma to the head. But beyond these clinical details lay the story of a young woman's final terrifying moments, alone with a monster who showed her no mercy. In the immediate aftermath of the murder, the investigation exploded with activity. Tips poured in from all over the community. Everyone wanted to help. Everyone had a theory. The police interviewed more than 1,500 people. They identified over 60 potential suspects. They followed up on every lead, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. They were determined to bring Christy's killer to justice. But as the investigation progressed, a frustrating pattern emerged. Every promising lead eventually hit a dead end. Every suspect was eventually cleared. The evidence collected at the scene, including biological samples that would later prove crucial, didn't match anyone in the existing databases. Whoever had killed Christy Mirack had no prior criminal record that would help identify them. They were, as far as the system was concerned, a ghost. The Christmas season that year was marked by grief and fear throughout Lancaster County. If someone could murder a beloved teacher in her own home, what did that say about the safety of the community? Parents worried about their children. Women worried about living alone. Everyone looked at their neighbors with a new sense of suspicion. Could the killer be someone they knew? Someone they saw at the grocery store or passed on the street? Christy's funeral was held during what should have been a time of celebration and joy. Instead of preparing for Christmas dinner and exchanging gifts with loved ones, her family and friends gathered to mourn a life cut tragically short. The church was packed with grieving students, fellow teachers, and community members who couldn't believe that someone so kind, so dedicated, so full of life, was gone. Her students, many of them only 11 or 12 years old, struggled to understand how their teacher could simply not be there anymore. As 1993 arrived, the investigation continued, but the initial momentum had begun to fade. The police were no closer to identifying a suspect than they had been on day one. The biological evidence collected at the scene sat in storage, waiting for technology that didn't yet exist to unlock its secrets. The case remained open, but as the months passed, it began to fade from the headlines. New crimes demanded attention. Resources were redirected. Christy's case, still unsolved, began its slow slide into the cold case files. But Christy's family never forgot. Her friends never stopped asking questions. And the investigators who had worked the case never stopped feeling the weight of their failure to bring her killer to justice. The file remained open, even as years turned into decades. Someone out there knew what had happened. Someone was living with the knowledge that they had murdered an innocent young woman. And somewhere in that evidence room, the key to solving the case was waiting to be discovered. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. And while you're at it, make sure you've hit that subscribe button and turned on notifications. We post new cold case investigations every week, and you don't want to miss when we expose another killer who thought they'd gotten away with murder. The 1990s were a time of massive change in forensic science. DNA analysis, which had been used to solve its first criminal case in the mid-1980s, was becoming more sophisticated and more widely available. But in the early days, the technology had significant limitations. The samples needed to be relatively large and well-preserved. The databases were small, containing only the profiles of convicted offenders. And the analysis itself was time-consuming and expensive. In Christy's case, biological evidence had been collected at the scene. This evidence contained the killer's DNA, a genetic fingerprint that was absolutely unique to one person on the entire planet. But in the immediate aftermath of the murder, this evidence couldn't point investigators to a specific individual. They could test suspects against it, but first they needed a suspect to test. And as the years passed without any viable suspects emerging, the DNA evidence sat unused, a silent witness to a terrible crime. Throughout the late 1990s and into the 2000s, cold case investigators would periodically revisit Christy's file. They would review the evidence, re-interview witnesses, and look for new angles that might have been missed in the original investigation. But each time, they came up empty. The biological evidence was compared against the growing databases of known offenders, but there were no matches. Whoever had killed Christy had either never been arrested for another crime, or they had committed their crimes before DNA collection became standard practice. The community slowly moved on, as communities always do. New teachers took over Christy's classroom. Her students grew up, graduated, went to college, started careers and families of their own. But many of them never forgot their sixth-grade teacher who had been taken from them so suddenly and violently. On the anniversary of her death each year, her family would hold a small memorial, keeping her memory alive and reminding the world that justice had still not been served. As the 10th anniversary of Christy's murder approached, the case seemed further from being solved than ever. The original investigators had retired or moved on to other departments. The physical evidence remained in storage, carefully preserved but seemingly useless without a suspect to compare it against. The case files contain thousands of pages of reports, interviews, and dead-end leads. But nowhere in all those pages was the name of Christy's killer. What the investigators and the community didn't know was that the killer was still there, living among them. Not hiding in some distant city or foreign country. Not living under an assumed name or constantly looking over his shoulder. He was right there in Lancaster County, living an ordinary life, interacting with people every single day, and maintaining the perfect facade of normalcy. This man was a popular disc jockey, a fixture at local weddings and celebrations. He was of Puerto Rican descent, well known in the Latino community and beyond. Every weekend, he would show up at venues throughout Lancaster County, setting up his equipment, taking requests, and getting people out on the dance floor. He was the soundtrack to countless celebrations, the person who made parties memorable, the friendly face behind the music at wedding receptions and anniversary parties. People loved him. He was charismatic, outgoing, and talented at what he did. He had built a successful business based on his reputation and his ability to read a crowd. When he walked into a venue to set up for an event, people would greet him warmly. When he played a requested song, couples would smile and thank him. When he packed up his equipment at the end of the night, satisfied clients would recommend him to their friends and family. And all the while, he was a murderer. All the while, he carried the knowledge that he had beaten a young teacher to death in her own home. All the while, he maintained his secret, never slipping, never confessing, never showing any outward sign that he was anything other than a successful local businessman and entertainer. The psychological profile of someone who could live such a double life is chilling. To murder someone with such brutality requires a complete lack of empathy, a willingness to inflict terrible suffering on another human being. But to then return to normal life, to interact with people at happy occasions, to smile and laugh and joke as if nothing had happened, requires a level of compartmentalization that most people simply cannot comprehend. How many times over those 26 years did someone hire him to DJ their wedding, completely unaware that they were celebrating one of the most important days of their lives with a killer? How many conversations did he have at events, standing around during breaks, talking about local news and community gossip, perhaps even discussing the unsolved murder that had shocked the area decades earlier? How many times did he drive past Christy's former home or the school where she had taught, knowing that he was the one who had destroyed so many lives that December morning? The audacity of his deception is staggering. Most criminals, especially those who commit crimes of passion or violence, eventually make mistakes. They tell the wrong person. They revisit the crime scene. They keep trophies that later incriminate them. They change their behavior in ways that draw attention. But this killer did none of those things. He simply continued living his life, hiding in plain sight, protected by the simple fact that no one suspected him. As the investigation dragged on through the 2000s and into the 2010s, advances in forensic science were revolutionizing cold case work across the country. DNA analysis became faster, cheaper, and more sensitive. Databases grew to include millions of profiles. New techniques allowed investigators to extract usable DNA from smaller and more degraded samples. And perhaps most significantly, the rise of consumer genetic testing services was creating vast databases of genetic information that could potentially be used to identify criminals through their family members. This last development would prove to be the key to finally solving Christy's murder. The technique, known as genetic genealogy or forensic genealogy, works by taking DNA from a crime scene and comparing it not to databases of known criminals, but to databases of people who have voluntarily submitted their DNA to services like 23andMe or Ancestry.com in hopes of learning about their heritage or finding distant relatives. When a partial match is found, investigators can use traditional genealogical research, public records, and family trees to work backwards and identify potential suspects. It's painstaking work that combines cutting-edge science with old-fashioned detective work, but it has proven incredibly effective at solving cold cases that had seemed hopeless. In 2018, this technique burst into the public consciousness when it was used to identify the Golden State Killer, a serial rapist and murderer who had terrorized California in the 1970s and 80s. The arrest of Joseph James DeAngelo, a former police officer who had been living quietly as a retiree, demonstrated the power of genetic genealogy to reach back decades and finally bring killers to justice. The success of the Golden State Killer case inspired cold case investigators across the country to revisit their unsolved murders and see if genetic genealogy might provide new leads. In Lancaster County, investigators pulled out Christy Mirack's file once again. They had good biological evidence from the crime scene. They had a complete DNA profile of the killer. What they needed was a way to connect that profile to a name. The investigation that followed was meticulous and methodical. Investigators worked with genetic genealogists to upload the killer's DNA profile to publicly available databases. They found matches, distant relatives who shared small amounts of DNA with the killer. From there, they began the painstaking process of building family trees, identifying common ancestors, and tracing those family lines forward to find living descendants who might be the killer. This work took months. Every potential suspect had to be carefully evaluated. Did they live in the Lancaster area in 1992? What was their age? Did they have any connection to Christy or the location where she was murdered? As the investigation progressed, the list of potential suspects narrowed. And eventually, one name emerged as the most likely candidate. Raymond Charles Rowe. The popular local disc jockey. The man who had spent decades performing at weddings and celebrations while harboring the darkest of secrets. But having a suspect and proving that suspect was guilty are two different things. The investigators needed to obtain a DNA sample from Rowe that they could compare directly to the DNA from the crime scene. And they needed to do it in a way that would hold up in court, that couldn't be challenged or thrown out on technical grounds. The solution they came up with was both simple and brilliant. They would collect a discarded DNA sample from Rowe, something he had touched or used and then thrown away. Under the law, once someone discards something in a public place, they have no expectation of privacy regarding that item. Police can legally collect it and test it without a warrant. In 2018, detectives attended an elementary school concert where they knew Rowe would be working as the DJ. They watched him throughout the event, waiting for their opportunity. And then, at some point during the evening, Rowe did something that would finally, after 26 years, lead to justice for Christy Mirack. He threw away a piece of chewing gum. That single piece of gum, discarded without a second thought, contained Rowe's DNA. Detectives collected it, carefully preserved it, and sent it to the lab for analysis. And when the results came back, they had their match. The DNA on that piece of chewing gum was an exact match to the DNA collected from Christy's crime scene 26 years earlier. Raymond Charles Rowe was Christy Mirack's killer. On June 25, 2018, nearly 26 years after Christy's murder, Raymond Rowe was arrested at his home. The news shocked the Lancaster community. The popular DJ, the man so many people knew and trusted, was a murderer. He had been living among them all this time, attending their celebrations, playing music at their children's weddings, all while carrying the terrible secret of what he had done. When confronted with the DNA evidence, Rowe initially maintained his innocence. But the science was irrefutable. His DNA was at the crime scene. His DNA was on Christy's body. There was no innocent explanation for how that could have happened. Eventually, facing the overwhelming evidence against him, Rowe entered a plea of guilty to first-degree murder. The details that emerged during the legal proceedings painted a picture of a random, brutal attack. Rowe had not known Christy Mirack. They had no prior relationship. On that December morning in 1992, Rowe had broken into her home, sexually assaulted her, and beaten her to death. His motive remains unclear, though the sexual assault suggests this was a crime of opportunity and predation. For Christy's family and friends, Rowe's arrest brought a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that the case was finally solved. Satisfaction that the killer would face justice. But also anger that he had been allowed to live freely for so many years, attending parties and celebrations while Christy lay in her grave. Anger that technology capable of identifying him had existed for years before investigators finally employed it. Anger at all the lost time, all the years when they had no answers. Christy's students, now adults with children of their own, learned that their beloved teacher's killer had finally been caught. Many of them had spent their entire adult lives knowing that somewhere out there, a murderer walked free. The news of Rowe's arrest allowed them to finally close that chapter, to know that justice, though delayed, had finally arrived. In October of 2018, Raymond Charles Rowe was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At 61 years old, he would spend whatever remained of his life behind bars, no longer able to maintain the facade of normalcy he had kept up for so long. The judge who sentenced him noted the brutality of the crime, the calculated way Rowe had continued his normal life afterward, and the pain his actions had caused to so many people over so many years. The case of Christy Mirack and Raymond Rowe raises profound questions about justice, about technology, and about the nature of evil. How does someone commit such a brutal crime and then simply return to normal life? How does a killer live for decades in the same community where they murdered someone, interacting with people daily, without ever arousing suspicion? The answer is both simple and disturbing. Most people are not equipped to recognize evil when it presents itself with a friendly face. We assume that murderers look dangerous, act strangely, or give off some kind of warning signal that allows us to identify them. But the reality is that many killers are perfectly normal in their daily interactions. They hold jobs, maintain relationships, and participate in their communities. The monster lurks beneath a carefully maintained surface, invisible to those around them. Rowe's case also highlights the critical importance of preserving evidence in unsolved cases. The biological samples collected from Christy's home in 1992 were carefully stored for 26 years, waiting for technology to advance enough to be useful. If that evidence had been destroyed or degraded, if proper collection and storage protocols hadn't been followed, Rowe might never have been identified. Every piece of evidence in an unsolved case represents a potential future breakthrough, a way to finally bring a killer to justice even decades after the crime. The role of genetic genealogy in solving cold cases has only grown since the arrest of Raymond Rowe. Hundreds of cases across the country have been solved using this technique, bringing closure to families who had waited years or even decades for answers. But the use of consumer DNA databases for law enforcement purposes has also raised privacy concerns. When people submit their DNA to learn about their ancestry, are they consenting to that information being used to identify their relatives as potential criminals? Where is the line between legitimate investigation and violation of privacy? These are complex questions without easy answers. But for Christy Mirack's family, for her former students, for everyone who loved her and sought justice for her murder, the benefits of this technology are clear. Without genetic genealogy, Raymond Rowe would likely never have been identified. He would have continued living freely, perhaps until his natural death, never facing consequences for the terrible thing he had done. The investigation that finally solved Christy's case required the efforts of dozens of people working across decades. The original investigators who collected and preserved the evidence. The cold case detectives who kept the file active and continued to seek new leads. The genetic genealogists who painstakingly built family trees and identified potential suspects. The laboratory technicians who analyzed the DNA samples. The prosecutors who built the case against Rowe. Each of them played a crucial role in finally bringing a killer to justice. But perhaps the most important lesson from Christy's case is simpler and more universal. It's the reminder that every victim deserves justice, no matter how much time has passed. That murder cases should never truly be closed, only solved. That somewhere in the evidence, in the files, in the memories of witnesses, lies the key to identifying even the most elusive killers. And that with persistence, with advancing technology, and with investigators who refuse to give up, even the coldest of cold cases can eventually be solved. Christy Mirack's life was cut short at 25 years old, decades of potential experiences stolen from her in one violent morning. She never got to continue her teaching career, never got to inspire more students, never got to fall in love and start a family, never got to grow old and look back on a life well lived. All of that was taken from her by Raymond Rowe's brutal attack. But in death, Christy became something more than just a victim. She became a symbol of the importance of never giving up on justice. Her case demonstrated that advancing technology could reach back through time to finally identify killers who thought they were safe. Her story inspired investigators working other cold cases to revisit their evidence and consider new approaches. And her memory lived on in the hearts of the students she taught, the colleagues she worked with, and the family and friends who loved her. The fact that Raymond Rowe lived among the Lancaster community for 26 years after murdering Christy is both horrifying and instructive. It reminds us that we can never truly know what darkness might lurk behind a friendly facade. That the person playing music at a wedding reception might be harboring terrible secrets. That evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. Sometimes it smiles and waves and goes about its daily business while carrying the weight of unspeakable crimes. For the people who hired Rowe to DJ their events over those 26 years, his arrest must have been deeply unsettling. To realize that they had welcomed a murderer into their celebrations, that they had danced to music played by someone who had brutally beaten a young teacher to death, that they had smiled and chatted with a killer. It's a violation of trust that extends beyond Rowe's direct victims to encompass an entire community that thought they knew him. The technology that finally solved Christy's case continues to advance. DNA analysis becomes more sophisticated every year, able to extract usable genetic information from smaller samples and more degraded evidence. Databases continue to grow, both in law enforcement systems and in consumer genetic services. Techniques for analyzing and interpreting complex DNA mixtures improve. And with each advancement, more cold cases become solvable, more families receive long-awaited answers, and more killers face justice they thought they had escaped. But technology alone isn't enough. Solving cold cases requires dedicated investigators willing to revisit old files and look at them with fresh eyes. It requires proper funding for cold case units and forensic laboratories. It requires a commitment from prosecutors to pursue decades-old cases even when they're more difficult and complex than fresh investigations. And it requires a criminal justice system willing to devote resources to victims whose murders might have happened before many current officers were even born. Christy Mirack's case exemplifies what can happen when all these elements come together. When evidence is properly collected and preserved. When investigators refuse to give up. When new technology is applied to old evidence. When the system works as it should, even if it takes decades, justice can finally be served. The students who sat in Christy's classroom during the fall of 1992, who were looking forward to Christmas break and a new year, who had no idea that their teacher would soon be taken from them, are now in their 40s. They've lived entire lives, experienced joys and sorrows, built careers and families, all while Christy remained frozen at 25, her life ended before it had barely begun. But now, at least, they know that her killer didn't escape justice. That the system, though slow, eventually worked. That Christy's murder was solved and her killer imprisoned. The psychological impact of unsolved murders on families and communities is profound and lasting. When someone is murdered and the case remains unsolved, it creates a perpetual wound that never fully heals. Every day brings the knowledge that somewhere out there, a killer walks free. Every holiday, every birthday, every anniversary is marked by the absence of the victim and the presence of unanswered questions. The inability to achieve closure, to know what happened and why, to see justice served, compounds the trauma of the original loss. For 26 years, Christy's family lived with that wound. Every Christmas season was a reminder of when she was taken from them. Every December 19th marked another year without answers. Every news story about a cold case being solved elsewhere brought the painful question of whether Christy's case would ever be solved. The arrest of Raymond Rowe couldn't bring Christy back, couldn't undo the decades of pain and uncertainty, but it did finally allow that wound to begin healing. The community of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, was also profoundly affected by Christy's unsolved murder. In a relatively small area where most people knew each other, the knowledge that a brutal killer was among them created an atmosphere of fear and suspicion. Women became more cautious about living alone. Parents worried more about their children's safety. The unsolved nature of the crime meant that everyone was potentially a suspect, that any neighbor or acquaintance could theoretically be the killer. Rowe's arrest lifted that shadow, even as it raised disturbing questions about how someone could hide among them for so long. The role of luck in finally solving Christy's case cannot be ignored. If Raymond Rowe had not thrown away that piece of chewing gum at the elementary school concert, investigators might never have obtained his DNA. If he had been more careful, more paranoid, more aware that technology was catching up to him, he might have avoided detection for years longer. The fact that decades of investigation ultimately came down to one discarded piece of gum highlights how cases can turn on the smallest details, the tiniest pieces of evidence. But calling it luck minimizes the hard work that went into creating the opportunity. Investigators had to identify Rowe as a suspect through painstaking genetic genealogy work. They had to find out where he would be and when. They had to surveil him and wait for the right moment to collect a sample. They had to properly collect and preserve that sample and get it tested. Luck played a role, but so did skill, persistence, and good old-fashioned detective work. Since Rowe's arrest and conviction, his case has been studied by law enforcement agencies across the country as an example of how genetic genealogy can solve seemingly impossible cold cases. Training seminars use it as a teaching tool. Cold case units looking to implement genetic genealogy techniques examine how the Lancaster investigators approached the case. And families of other cold case victims see Christy's solved case as a beacon of hope that their own cases might someday be solved as well. The financial and emotional costs of maintaining cold case investigations are substantial. Evidence must be stored properly for decades, requiring climate-controlled facilities and careful documentation. Files must be kept accessible and organized. Detectives must periodically review cases even when there are no new leads. And families must be kept informed, maintaining relationships built on shared hope for justice even as years pass without progress. Many jurisdictions struggle to allocate resources to cold cases when they're also dealing with fresh investigations that seem more pressing and more solvable. But Christy's case demonstrates the value of that investment. The evidence collected in 1992 was still viable in 2018. The files maintained over those decades provided crucial background when new techniques became available. The relationships maintained with Christy's family ensured they were immediately notified when a breakthrough occurred. None of this would have been possible if the case had been completely abandoned or if evidence had been destroyed to save storage space. As we reflect on Christy Mirack's case and the 26-year journey to justice, we're reminded that solving crimes is not always about dramatic breakthroughs or brilliant deductions. Sometimes it's about patience. About careful preservation of evidence. About refusing to give up even when years pass without progress. About being ready to apply new technology when it becomes available. About the intersection of science and traditional detective work. About the collective efforts of dozens of people over decades, each playing their small part in eventually achieving justice. Raymond Rowe will spend the rest of his life in prison, finally paying for the terrible crime he committed in December of 1992. He will never again play music at a wedding reception. Never again smile at partygoers while hiding his dark secret. Never again walk freely through the Lancaster community he terrorized and deceived. The friendly facade has been permanently stripped away, revealing the monster beneath. For Christy Mirack, justice came far too late. She never got to see her killer caught. Never got to testify against him or see him sentenced. Her life was over before DNA technology advanced enough to identify him. But her case lives on as proof that murders can be solved no matter how much time has passed, that killers can eventually be caught no matter how well they hide, and that victims deserve justice even decades after their deaths. The science that solved Christy's case continues to evolve and improve. Genetic genealogy techniques become more refined. DNA databases grow larger. Analysis methods become more sophisticated. Each advancement brings the potential to solve more cold cases, to bring closure to more families, to catch more killers who thought they had escaped justice. Christy's case was one of the early successes of this technology, paving the way for hundreds of other cases to be solved using similar methods. But we must also remember that behind every cold case is a person like Christy. A beloved daughter. A dedicated teacher. A friend. Someone with hopes and dreams and a future that was stolen from them. Someone whose family has lived for years or decades without answers. Someone whose community was traumatized by their unsolved murder. The statistics and the science can make us forget the human element, the real people whose lives were ended and whose loved ones suffered. Christy Mirack was more than just a cold case number. She was a real person who deserved better than the fate Raymond Rowe inflicted upon her. As this case demonstrates, the work of solving murders never truly ends. Even when decades pass, even when cases seem hopeless, even when everyone involved in the original investigation has retired or passed away, the possibility of justice remains. New investigators take up old files. New technology reveals new leads. New witnesses come forward. And sometimes, after 26 years, a discarded piece of chewing gum finally brings a killer to justice. This is the story we needed to tell. The story of Christy Mirack, a young teacher whose life was brutally ended just before Christmas. The story of a killer who hid in plain sight for 26 years, living openly in the community he had terrorized. The story of investigators who never gave up, who kept the case alive across decades, who were ready to apply new technology when it became available. And ultimately, the story of justice delayed but not denied, of a cold case finally solved, of a victim finally vindicated. If you've made it this far in Christy's story, then you understand why Cold Case Room exists. These cases matter. These victims deserve to be remembered. These killers deserve to be exposed. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel so you never miss when we bring you another case of justice finally served. Hit that like button to help the algorithm show this video to more people. And drop a comment telling us which cold case you want us to investigate next. Share this video with anyone who cares about true crime and justice. Every view, every like, every comment helps us continue this work. Christy Mirack's story deserves to be told, and so do the stories of thousands of other cold case victims still waiting for justice. This is Cold Case Room, where the truth never stays buried forever.